I'm very pleased to introduce Ed Nersessian, co-director of the Philoctetes Center, who has played more than an instrumental role in making this whole thing happen, who has been an incredible source of both inspiration and ideas, and really is tremendously responsible for everything that is going on here tonight. And he will introduce our panelists, and take it, Ed.
Thanks. I will introduce the panelists alphabetically, so I would appreciate if they would nod or raise their hand. Christian de Duve is the Andrew Mellon Professor Emeritus at Rockefeller University and Professor at Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, Emeritus also. He won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine with two other scientists in 1974. And his last book is Singularities, Landmarks on the Pathways of Life. James P. Ferris is research professor at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's the director of the New York Center for Studies on the Origins of Life. And for 18 years, he was editor of the journal Origins of Life and Evolution of the Biosphere. Colin McGinn is professor of philosophy at Rutgers at the moment. He's moving to Florida to the University of Miami. He has a special interest in the philosophy of mind, consciousness, intentionality, and imagination. And I believe his latest book is The Making of a Philosopher, but he has other books sitting there on that table. Mark Norell is chairman and curator, Division of Paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. His last book is Unearthing the Dragon, and interestingly, he also has books for children, I think mostly grade school children. And Robert Pollack is professor of biological sciences at Columbia University and the director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion. His latest book is The Fate of Biology and the Biology of Faith, Order, Meaning, and Free Will in Modern Science. After the meeting tonight, there will be a book signing, and some of the books of our participants are sitting there. Because we don't have enough room up here, some of the audience is downstairs in the auditorium, and if they have any questions, they can write them on cards, and they will be brought up for the panel here. If somebody wants to make a comment from downstairs, they can just walk up or take the elevator up and make their comment here. I will not be moderating tonight, so I will not be asking any questions to direct the discussion, but I would hope that there would be a dialogue developing amongst our participants in a spontaneous way without much preparation. But to get it going, I will ask the participants to start by saying, what is it they consider life? What is the definition of life? Thank you. Whoever wants to start.
I'll start.
Okay.
That's something, since I'm concerned with the origin of life, that immediately becomes a question. What are you concerned about the origin of? What is it? At that stage, at the stage of origin life, I believe that that's going to be a very small difference between what isn't alive and what is alive, and you may even be great difficulty discerning what's alive and what isn't alive in this particular situation. And coming from my point of view, trying to get to that point, I like a very simple definition of life. That is something that can self-replicate with change, mutate. And that's all, because that lets you put it down at the very molecular level, and that's all you have to get together to get a living system. So I'm trying to make it easy for myself in the task I'm taking on. Others, I think in the more biological community, would like to have, in terms of what is the first life, something that has a membrane or something around it, and something that has a metabolism as well. So I can understand that as well. So as I look at life from a chemical point of view, that's what I'm sort of looking forward to.
I will only comment after Professor de Duve does. It seems to me only.
But I'll make it very simple. As far as I'm concerned, life is what is common to all living organisms. Now, that may sound like a tautology, but it is not. It means that many things are not needed for life. You don't need a brain. You don't need limbs. You don't need green leaves. You don't need many cells. A single cell is enough. And if you just look at what is common between you and the E. coli you have in your gut, you will find what really makes life on Earth. There may be other kinds of life, I don't know, but life on Earth is what we have in common with E. coli in our guts.
Okay. I'll give two answers. The first as a scientist, and the second as a religious person. The first answer is life is an event in the history of the universe, which so far as we know occurred in only one place and at only one time about 5 billion years ago. Life has never ended, although it is dependent on the death of lives. So lives are mortal in that life will be able to persist through natural selection and the emergence of novelty, through selection of variants. So I would say life is mortal, persistent, on this planet, and so far as we know, unique in the universe. It is also the source of our brains. As Darwin said, the mind is an excretion of our brains, and in our brains are ideas including notions of free will and notions of altruistic obligation to strangers, which seem to be free of any natural selective advantage. So I would say life, as we know it, is an historical event that has generated us, and through us, the burdens of free will.
And there's a couple of things you can say about that. One is that scientists, I mean, me as an empiricist, I would just say that life is how scientists define life as to be. And that whether that's just replicating DNA or whether it's just catalytic activity, that it only becomes really interesting as a scientist if we can really define something and point to it on a phylogenetic tree, meaning a tree of life, and say, well, this really is life, and we're going to start from there. As far as the non-altruistic activity, that I think there's a lot of, there really is a lot of models as far as how evolution works, as far as group selection, as far as other things work, which indicate that some of these things that you might look at as non-altruistic activity for the individual is highly altruistic for the species or the group of whatever that they're working in. So that, and it's something that one of my colleagues, Niles Eldridge, has talked about a lot. It's just that there's both levels of organization, there's also levels of how selection works and how some of these other things work. So in getting down to the point of exactly where life started, that I think that from the empirical point of view, we're much better off saying that we can define life as something, as an individual, as opposed to a class-like behavior. So I'm perfectly willing just to say that self-sustaining, replicating DNA is life.
I think it would be folly to try to define life. As a philosopher who's interested in definitions, I can always poke holes in all definitions. I mean, if you say it's self-replicating with mutations, what about the question of, crystals replicate too, and they do have changes in what happens to them. So what exactly, they wouldn't count as life in any intuitive sense.
Crystals, but crystals are pretty, that's all they do. They just crystallize. I mean,
they produce duplicates of each other.
Well, you put a seed in a saturated
variation.
solution,
Right.
But that's not. Is that replication? Well, that's why with change is put in there.
That's the question, right? Is it replication? Not in the sense of life replication.
No.
It involves a duplication of an entity following an initial prototype, and there, of course, are going to be variations due to physics in the way those replications occur. So that would be a problem. Also, if you define it in terms of just of reproduction, what if you came across a species on Mars or in some other part of the universe that didn't replicate, didn't reproduce? There they are. They come into existence. They're just like some animal on Earth or different, but they don't actually give birth to anything. They're not living. That sounds wrong too. That's a definition, right? If you want to get the concept of life, what philosophers call a necessary and sufficient condition for life, I think it's very difficult. You can get typical characteristics of life as it's found on Earth, absolutely.
So make it restrictive.
What's that?
Make it restrictive. Don't call that stuff on Mars life.
Well, that would be wrong there. They are living, aren't they? They'd be living things.
No, not necessarily.
No evidence for that. Why do you muddy the problem of definition by postulating things for which you have no evidence? In the evidence we have, life is tragic. It began, it persists, it requires the death of all individuals, including individuals capable of self-awareness of their own death. It's tragic, therefore, individually for us. And on the global scale, it's tragic because every 100 million years or so, a disaster enters from outer space which obliterates 90% of the families of living things and provides a design space for the emergence of new novelty. That is not a difficult definition to make. Life is the evanescent moment for the individual and the persistence of DNA replication with variation for the global definition. They don't match up for anyone who is alive and self-aware. Yeah. That's the problem.
Being tragic doesn't seem a necessary condition for being alive.
Well, it just depends on
people
say.
Might just the concept
no, you
of
say
being
the
alive
opposite, so you can say.
I mean, we've got two definitions: being tragic versus self-replication with mutation. Those are not the same thing at all. Obviously, they're totally different ideas. But all sorts of things could have a tragic existence and not be alive, and they could be alive without having a tragic existence. They're not the same concept, right?
But to try to get it away from like class-like things, that we could, in an evolutionary sense, we could just say that, everything that we say is life, as Dr. Duve pointed out, is that everything that we say is life today is what was the common ancestor of the first life. Everything that,
yeah. Well,
if I may add something here, because I think this is getting a very esoteric kind of definition. What is life and what is not life? I think we have to look at life as we know it. I mean, there may be other kinds of life, but life as we know it depends on the existence of replicable DNA, on RNA, on proteins, on enzymes, and that's life is chemistry. It's chemistry which has given rise to information through the possibility of replication, variation, selection. But we have to look at life the way we know it. And if we're looking at the origin of life, as Jim has been doing for I don't know how many years, Jim, at least 20, you have to look at life as it works today and see how did this particular life that we know of, how did that originate? And whether there are other kinds of life with other kinds of chemicals or other kinds of elements are being used, I think is immaterial to
we just don't know. So
the actual problem.
So we don't need to define life in general in order to answer the question about origins.
But
Absolutely
if
right.
we're going to answer the origin of life on Earth, we do have to do that.
That's fine. And the origin of life on Earth is fine. I mean, as long as when I say it's fine, I mean we still don't really have a definition. If that means something which analytically captures the concept of life, we don't need a definition. It's not necessary.
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
You can define by pointing at things, saying that's alive, that's alive, that's alive, and things like that. You don't have to give a necessary and sufficient condition that logically defines the concept.
Well, if you're concerned with the origin of life, you do. I mean, you really have to decide what it really means, what it really is.
Why would you? You just need to point to some paradigm instances, plants and various animals, and say, I'm interested in the origin of those. You don't need to know what some general definition of life to do that.
But the first life is not going to look like an animal, plant, or anything we see right now. It's going to be an exceedingly simple piece of chemistry.
We'll talk about those things.
Can you construct in a living world, including yourself, a safe place in which to ask this question experimentally, or are you doomed by the fact of the history of this life that you cannot make a place safe enough from it to ask the question of its emergence? Can you visualize emergence as an experimental process?
Yeah.
Subject to your own study? Then in that experimental process, what in that do you define as success?
So basically it would be a self-replicating system.
So that would include presumably information replication in a computer completely devoid of physical, and the internet then in a sense can be thought of as alive by that definition.
Well, that's one of the points I was going to make. Yeah.
No, because that's only the software. Life is the hardware.
Well, that's what I'm not being, I'm trying, I don't know enough to be clever here. I'm simply asking, if you want to draw this out of nature and you want to reproduce it in experimental terms, you have a testable hypothesis. The testable hypothesis is that the minimal requirement is self-replication with variation.
Right.
What's the selection you place on that for natural selection to emerge in your artificial life? Or are you satisfied as life without natural selection? Because that would seem to me to be too simple.
If you have what life with origin of life replication would change, there's your
and who
selection.
provides the selection there as nature itself provides the selection that gave us being? Do you provide the selection there?
Well, I provide the no
Computer model.
Yeah. Well, in a computer model or in the test tube in which he's got DNA emerging from bases and then it replicates and then it shows variation. How does it enter nature and show itself to be alive by the emergence of novelty, persistent speciation? And if it doesn't, why is it life?
How does it show itself?
How does it emerge as living when you start in an experimental system? What's the universe it's in? Presumably, life when it began was in a universe that had no life in it. Your experimental process is to have that happen a second time in a world teeming with life.
Oh, no, we couldn't, there's no chance for that to happen in a world teeming with life. It's going to happen in a setup in a laboratory where you can see that you can demonstrate through various chemical means this is indeed self-replicating, and you can also show that it is changing at the same time.
But until you drop it into the real world and have it survive, why is it life and not the zoo version of life?
But it's impossible for that. And the first life is going to be terribly ineffective. It's not going to do things very well at all. It can't possibly compete in this world that we have today.
That's my point. Thank you. So our definitions, in fact, hardly overlap, because mine is, if you can't compete in this world, you fail natural selection and you're not part of life.
Well, you were there first, so you were very successful at natural selection.
Dr. Duve's definition was all things alive, not all things that once were. And to be alive means to persist in this world, by the statement that we're not talking about Mars. So I think if you simply accept Dr. Duve's apparently mild restriction, it excludes the experimental protocol, doesn't it? Because you can't bring the product of the protocol into the natural world to see if it's alive or not in nature. Or let me ask everybody else, is nature a prerequisite to life, or is a laboratory a sufficient environment?
Well, that's the only place you could demonstrate this process, or you could see this process. You can't. It just could not survive anywhere else. That's the situation.
Okay.
Presumably, if you made some robots in the lab, computer-based robots which replicated, and there was some analog of natural selection, are they alive?
With robots, I don't know. But yeah,
say not.
Where would you like to change it to?
Well, the origin of life.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, I see.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Right. Well, first I'd like to say one thing. This is just personal, but I'm very happy to participate in a meeting which is organized by an organization that wants to explore imagination, because scientists are not supposed to have imagination according to the two-culture divide, and I think this is completely wrong. Scientists need as much imagination as artists and philosophers. The only difference is that scientists have to curb their imagination and have it fit with facts. So they're not free as writers or artists. They have to stick with facts. Now, as far as the origin of life is concerned, we do have a few facts, which you may interpret one way or another. And the first fact that I would like to underline is the recent findings last 20 or 30 years that the chemical building blocks of life, amino acids, the sugars, the nitrogenous bases, the fatty acids, are made everywhere in the universe. Now, I won't go into the details, but let's say the main proof is the analysis of meteorites. Meteorites, at least in the solar system, these chemicals arise spontaneously. So what is called organic chemistry is really a banal chemistry. It's the chemistry of carbon. It's a natural chemistry of carbon. So the building blocks are made everywhere, which is, after all, an important point. The second point that we do know also with a considerable degree of confidence, if not certainty, is that all known living beings are descendants from a single ancestral form, the so-called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. Now, microbes, bacteria, protists, fungi, animals, plants, humans, we all are descendants of this single ancestral form that existed on Earth between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago. That's a fact. I can go into the proof, but it's a fact. Now, the third point, which I think is extremely important, maybe not a fact, but it's an inference that we derive from all that we know about life, namely that in this long process from the building blocks of life, assuming they served as building blocks in the origin of life, up to Luca, which is the ancestor of us all, this very long process, there is one very important landmark, a watershed, and that is the appearance by chemistry, which did all the stuff before, of molecules capable of replication. Now, what I mean is molecules capable of inducing the synthesis of copies of themselves. They don't replicate themselves. They serve as copies for some machine that makes the copying. And with these molecules, which almost certainly are RNA, I'm saying Jim will agree with me, he spent all his life working on this. With the appearance of these molecules, appeared for the first time in this pathway that was ruled by chemistry, appeared for the first time a phenomenon called replication. Replication is the ability to induce copies of themselves. If you have perfect replication, you have endless repetition of the same reproduction. That's the basis of genetic continuity. It's because they are owners of molecules that can serve in perfect replication that children resemble their parents more than they resemble the parents of other children. Mice beget mice, acorns, oak trees, whatever. Genetic continuity. Replication never being perfect, from time to time you have imperfect copies that start by perfect replication, lineages of variants. The variants compete, and in this competition, for resources in this competition, the most able to survive and especially reproduce under the existing conditions, which is the major point in this, you have selection. That's Darwin's major contribution. And he didn't know anything about DNA. He didn't know anything even about genes. And he came up with that. And that selection started the day the first RNA molecule appeared, together with the mechanism for replication. And it's been going on ever since for 3.5 or more billion years, chemistry plus selection. That's the history of life. Sorry, it's a long.
Well, yes, beautifully stated, and absolutely. I think myself there are three questions of origins: the origin of the physical universe, the origins of life, and the origins of consciousness. I think that we have a pretty good understanding of the origins of the physical universe in the Big Bang and cosmological theories. Not every question is answered within those theories, but we know we have a basic understanding inferred from the present state of the universe back to the Big Bang, and we understand that it must be an explosion which caused the expansion of the universe. So that's pretty well understood. There's no area of massive ignorance there. In the case of life, it's well understood, and you just gave the absolutely elegant explanation of the basic theory. And again, we have a good model of the mechanical process that leads to life becoming more complex, and the way natural selection operates, and and the way species develop. And again, there's not that there's no questions that are unanswered, but there's a good basic understanding. So imagine the universe starting with the Big Bang, however many billion years it was before life began to evolve on Earth or in other parts of the universe, and then life began to evolve on Earth 3 billion years ago, you said, and that goes on until we get to where we are now. At some point in that second stage, there was another ontological upheaval, not just matter and space or life, but mind, consciousness. And it seems to me in that area, it's equally massive, it's equally momentous as the first two developments, but it's completely not understood. We don't have any model, even the beginnings of a model, of how consciousness arose during the course of evolution. So at some point there were these molecules, and they're replicating each other, and their variations and their selection, and there's no consciousness in the universe. It's a completely insensate, mindless cosmos, just
Nobody's asking about the origin of life.
Right, no, it's nothing, or not even less than that. And it goes on for however billion years it may have gone on in that way. And at some point, other organisms developed. I wouldn't speculate about which they would be. We can argue about what they might be. But at some point, they got brains, and those brains were organizing their movements and hence protecting them against their adversaries and so on, and enabling them to find food. And those brains at some point gave rise, we don't know how, to consciousness, feelings, sensations, awareness of the world. Now, there are many questions about that. Why did it arise? Why at all?
But part of that is like, what is it? Because
what is it?
I mean, I think the origin of the universe, you can point to one thing, the Big Bang.
Right.
Origin of life, we've argued a little bit about it. We've basically decided on catalytic activity, replication, and either DNA or an RNA. But consciousness is many things to many people. And looking at it in the history of, hominid evolution and other things, of, whether it's language, whether it's the origin of art, whether it's the origin of other things.
We can discuss what consciousness is. I mean, I was hoping we'd let
if you're going to argue,
can certainly go on to what it is.
My point to where it originated, you have to decide what it is first to try to find it.
However we define it, there was at some point at which it came about, right?
Well, it depends on how you define it.
Yeah, how you define it.
Well, however you define it, there'll be some time in which it came about, right? How could it not be so?
Let's define it. Whether it's one thing or many things.
Yeah.
Let's define it. There are many things you can mean by the word consciousness.
No, but whether consciousness means many things as far as a gradual transformation toward what one person would define as consciousness, or whether it's a single thing that you can just say that this is consciousness and this isn't.
I'm not sure I understand you, but let me define what I mean by consciousness. There are many things that can be meant by it. Sometimes people mean self-consciousness, awareness of one's own mental activity. That's certainly not what I mean by it. I mean consciousness, and that's why I said earlier on sensation, awareness, and so forth. So it just means basic awareness of the environment, nothing very fancy, which would include things like pain sensations of pleasure too,
I think
or
that
visual
from the
sensations.
earliest forms of bacterial single-celled life, there is consciousness by that definition, insofar as you have photoreceptors that draw you toward or away from light.
I don't think so.
Insofar as you have receptors that draw you toward or away from nutrition.
Yeah,
to be experiencing the
at all.
environment is a prerequisite of the simplest forms of life.
They don't
You can't mean
exist.
consciousness by that. You must be something formed through neural networks that require multicellularity, that require neural differentiation, that require networks of greater complexity to a large power than the number of cells that connect to each other because of the number of connections per cell.
That's
So
not what I
you
mean
must
by
mean
consciousness.
something larger than what you just said. It can't be just sensation.
I mean exactly what I said, but I don't mean by it mere responsiveness to external stimuli, because a computer could do that, a robot could do that with no consciousness. I mean
There are no
sentience.
robots and computers without people. I don't understand what that has to do with anything.
A machine without consciousness, without sentience, could respond to the environment. I mean, there's an inner life. There's the idea of a sensation, a feeling, a state of consciousness. I mean, the phrase that's used by philosophers, that some of you may know, is there's something it's like to be that thing. So what is the difference between a non-conscious entity and a conscious one? A conscious one is one such that there's something it's like to be
sorry,
that.
I don't
Some way the
understand.
world seems to it.
Are
Qualia
you,
is
are you
another
saying
term
that
that's
is
used.
or is not an emergent property of natural phenomena?
It is an emergent property. I've not said anything about that, but it is an emergent property, yeah. But the question I'm trying to focus on is, let's just take primitive sensation. Let's just take the sensation of pain, to make it simple. At some point, that sensation came into existence, evolved. It wasn't there from the beginning of the universe. It wasn't there from the beginning of life. It emerged at some point when certain organisms of certain complexity came about. The point I just want to make is we don't have any theory of that. We don't have even the beginnings of a theory of how that sensation arose. Not the mere functional responsiveness something has to the environment. I think could have that without the sensation. But the sensation, the feeling, that quality of consciousness that's there. Well, that's the problem which so many people, including scientists, think is the largest outstanding problem of science today.
Well, when you talk about the feeling of pain, that even could come out of selection. That certainly is something that's very good to have. Can't you look, I look at this as the same thing as you start with the origin of life from something very simple and it evolves from this. I can't see why, as organisms became more complex, you came from these various simple responses to the environment to develop this more complex system. I grant you, I don't really understand the details of consciousness, but I could see it seems to be it's coming out of our neural systems as they evolve.
It does come from neural systems. The problem is we don't have any theory or analysis of the mechanism. In the case of life and the origin of the universe, we know we have an idea of the mechanism.
I think you're right.
If the universe is expanding, an explosion is a mechanism which causes expansion of matter. In the case of natural selection and evolution, natural selection operating on physical entities and the competition for resources, we know the mechanism. If you say, what's the mechanism by which neurons generate consciousness, you can't answer it.
Socialization. There are in mammals order of magnitude 10 to the 13th, 10 to the 14th neural cells in their brains. There are order of magnitude thousands to hundreds of thousands of connections among cells to each other. Therefore, there are many millions of times more connections in a born brain than there are base pairs in the DNA encoding this whole organism. That brain can become a mind only by socialization, only by interaction, not just with the environment in general, but usually with family members, usually in what we would call family social structures. The emergence of consciousness, I would argue, is a byproduct of the emergence of socialization as a strategy for survival. It and socialization go together. There are no single organisms with consciousness. That would be the mechanism for the explosion. An idea is in the room. We're socialized creatures to such a point we're not even conscious of it.
But again, that's a very loaded definition of consciousness.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Certainly like that consciousness as the way we originally talked about was just the awareness of your environment.
Yeah.
And while we can't, look at how like Caenorhabdites or something like that looks at its environment, we can certainly measure the effects of the way that it looks at its environment.
I agree with
you.
I agree with you.
Turn a blowtorch on it, they go away.
Well, isn't the problem with consciousness is we have a way of understanding science. We set up a certain sort of rules. Here's what we do. Here's what we say. Here's what it is. With consciousness, we don't have anything like that. We have no criteria, so we can't do any testing.
Do you think we should go on talking about what we don't know?
I don't think that
we could spend a lot of time. There's a lot we don't know. Perhaps it might be interesting to look at a few details that relate to what we know. And I don't know whether...
Go ahead. always happy to learn more.
Next time I keep silent. No, I think, at least from my point of view, we've been discussing evolution, and I would like to bring up for discussion the question between chance and necessity in biology. How much chance, how much necessity? As I'm sure most of you know, the sort of dominant notion, I wouldn't call it a doctrine, is that the whole history of life has been ruled by contingency. I'm sure your friend Steve Jay Gould, who was one of the many advocates of this theory. Jacques Monod, who's a friend of mine, was another advocate of this theory. And this is sort of, I think, part of the message that the general public receives from the more vocal biologists and scientists, that the history of life is ruled by contingency, which means that, as Steve Gould said in his famous tape analogy, you rewind the tape and let it run again, you get a completely different story. Now, I think there is a slight weakness in this theory. Let's analyze what is it based on. It's based on the fact, which we all agree on, that the variants that are offered through natural selection are products of chance. I mean, they're not intentional, they're accidental. They're not goal-directed, they're products of chance. And so the idea is that, of course, selection can only work on whatever variants are offered to it. I mean, there may be a much better one. If it's not offered by chance, selection will not make it emerge.
But there's one aspect about that that's beyond just chance. There's also constraint, because not everything is possible.
Oh, I agree with you.
So, I mean, that it's not just contingency and chance, it's also constraint.
I was sort of coming to that, but I'm glad you interrupted me. No, the point is that, you see, I think implicitly the idea behind the whole contingency doctrine is that chance offers only a small sampling of all the possibilities for selection to act on. So if you start again, chance will give you another sampling and something else will come out. And what is neglected is what maybe everyone looks as an impossible possibility, namely that chance offers most or all of the possible choices, so that selection will end up bringing repeatedly the optimal solution, if you get everything. And so the point I've been defending in the last few years, and touting my latest book now, namely is that in many cases, chance may in fact have offered selection a sufficiently wide or exhaustive array of possibilities so that repeatedly the optimal will in fact come out.
I want to ask you a question before you go on.
Yes.
I appreciate very much what you're saying, but that will be so on time scales up to 10 to 100 million years. And then an asteroid will remove 90% of the species and families and genera big enough to see, and the design space will reopen for a chance to try again. But I picked the word advisedly. I consider that to be a tragic fact, that all of this incremental approach toward an optimum, which by the argument of constraints on randomness generating a similar outcome despite different local mutations, that surely isn't the consequence of survival after these catastrophes. Each catastrophe is accompanied by a flowering of wholly novel structures. And I think Steve Gould would, since we take the sainted Steve Gould's name in vain, he would certainly be the first person to say the Ediacarian structures disappeared 250 million years ago and outpopped those ancestors of us. Dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago and outpopped the large mammals. That constraint on the history of life is wholly decoupled from any possibility of approach to an optimum. It is as if someone goes smack, throws the experiment out, and starts over. It is a rewinding of the tape, and we're the product of it at least 5 known times. So how then does that fit to your picture?
Well, I'll cut my talk short, because I was going to demonstrate that you can win the lottery with 99.9%, but I will spare you that. But the point is really is that, you see, what you are pointing out, I think, is really the most important point, and that is really where the contingency comes in, is the environmental changes. Because what life has demonstrated throughout its 3.5 or 4 billion year history is its extraordinary ability to adapt to almost any kind of environmental change. I mean, I think when you look at, say, you go to the Museum of Natural History and you see an insect that looks exactly like the leaf on which it sits, or like the branch on which it sits. I mean, this is a fantastic event of adaptation to local circumstances. And so I think this, to me, is the property of life, is the ability to mold itself to whatever environment. So So now the question about the dinosaurs, for instance, and the mammals, the question is whether that kind of contingency is, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't know exactly how to define it, but it's something that would have happened only once in the whole history of the universe. That would, or something that would have happened some other time because of some other reason. The dinosaurs were probably doomed in any case because they were too big, but at some stage their environment wasn't able to support them, and the little mammals came up. So if the asteroid hadn't fallen on Yucatan 65 million years ago, something else. The same thing with the advent of humankind. I mean,
excuse me, I'm not very knowledgeable in this, but why did the dinosaurs get to be so big?
what is the dinosaur?
Get to be so big. If natural selection was working, why did they become so big?
Well, there's a couple of things here. One is that the whole argument about impacts and extraterrestrial bolides hitting the planet and causing these big extinctions, it's not very well supported at all. For instance, dinosaurs aren't extinct now. Birds are a kind of dinosaur, just like humans are a kind of primate. And that if you were to look at the diversity of dinosaurs by the same sort of metric that we look at the diversity of all other life, that we would say that dinosaurs are more diverse today than they ever were, because we have over 10,000 species of living dinosaurs on the planet today. If we go back to the Mesozoic era, the time that people call the age of the dinosaurs, if we look at time slices, the best that we can measure them worldwide, which are about, I would say, 5 to 7 million years that we can correlate across the planet. And we look for the time period where we can find the most living dinosaurs at any time period. We can find about 100, 2 orders of magnitude different than the living diversity. Now, if you look at the same sorts of calculations that people make of insects, of flowering plants, of other things, and you just see that these graphs that they make of the number of fossils, number of species towards the present, and there's this pull of the present as you get more and more and more and more until we have this great diversity today. Well, a lot of that is just artifact of the fossil record. And if you add birds to that, we would easily say that dinosaurs are really diverse today. I mean, obviously some of them went extinct, obviously the world changed at the end of the Mesozoic, but nevertheless that these huge changes that we talk about really don't exist. And that, in fact, that even if the large non-avian dinosaurs were becoming less and less diverse over the last 10 million years of the Cretaceous period, also that we're really limited in what we can say, because that places on the planet that preserve in terrestrial sections, the places which preserve the meteorite impact, where we can actually look for fossils at the same place, that there's only 2, and they're about 100 miles away from each other, and they're in the same formation, so that there's 1 degree of freedom to do any statistical analyses on this, which means that it tells you nothing. So that empirically you cannot, it's an intractable question at this point about whether or not that the impact had any effect on the terrestrial record of dinosaurs.
Can I follow that up? I mean, I'm curious to understand.
Actually, you can say something about foraminiference, but you can't say anything about the terrestrial record. And if you go to the Permo-Triassic hit, it's the same thing. It's even worse there because you can't correlate as well. So that you have, with any of these major catastrophes in Earth history, you have to decide what's a major catastrophe. Is it something that happens overnight? Or is it something that happens on a scale of 5 years, of 10 years, of 100 years, or of 1,000 years? And at the Permo-Triassic boundary, the best that you can correlate worldwide is about 10 million years. So that means that your ticks on a clock are that something that happened within 10 million years, or something that happened more than 10.
I welcome actually the freedom of action that this absence of data brings. But I still don't know that you've given trouble to what I think Professor Duve said that I think I agreed with. That is, regardless of the multiplicity of species of dinosaurs we call birds, and regardless of their persistence through the 65 million year ago disaster, is it or isn't it the case that mammals, shrew-like mammals, things that look like very small monkeys sitting on trees at the head of the fourth floor exhibit in the museum were mammals from 250, 200 million years to 65 million years ago as a stable slice of the ecology of the planet, and then they radiated out from 65 million years to about 50 million years into the ancestral mammals that are in the sea, in the air, and here.
Yeah, I think a lot of that probably has to do with what we call the pull of the present, is that the fossil record gets better and better and better as we come here. Because molecular clocks of phylogeny that we do indicates all mammal diversity happened in the early Cretaceous about 125 million years ago.
I didn't ask my question properly. Yeah. I'm hopelessly anthropocentric in this question. Are you saying, apropos the idea of the design space opened by random mutation somehow being driven to optimum nevertheless, are you saying, consistent with that, that things like us, the things that carry self-consciousness, if not some more generalized consciousness as well, things like us are predetermined to have arisen, our ancestors were there all along, absent the 65 million year hit, we'd be here anyway, and we would not be smart birds, but rather still smart mammals, even though mammals were so repressed in the environment for 150 million years before the hit. Diverse but small, diverse but not smart.
I'm not really one who believes.
I'm asking, I don't know the answer.
I'm not one who agrees with the idea that selection and everything else moves toward optimality criteria, as far as that optimality criteria being something which is, we would say, better than something else, because I think that a lot of times it gets tied up in a lot of other things.
So are we not contingent, I guess is my question.
I say we are contingent. Okay. I say we're just the luck of the draw.
Me too. That's all I was pushing for, is that when you clear away everything else, we might not have been here, but we are.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to comment on Professor Duve's way of putting it, which connects with this. I mean, the question is, do beings of our kind exist necessarily or contingently? And it may well be. You were arguing that there's an array of possibilities thrown up by chance, but selection processes get optimized within those things. But my question was, what's meant by optimize? If it means make them maximally reproductive, the answer might be yes. But that, of course, is consistent with everything stopping at the level of the cockroach. So if it means by optimize tend in the direction of intelligent beings such as ourselves, then it seems to me we don't really have an argument for that yet. All we have is an argument that the space of the possibilities thrown up, given the realities of selection, there'll be an optimization for some parameter or other. And I assume it's a biological one, such as how well they survive in their environments, and not the kind of thing that Gould was interested in, whether we, as the kind of species we are, necessarily evolved. Gentlemen, so everything you said seems to be consistent with supposing that Gould was right about that.
Gentlemen, we're sitting here as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 European males, exemplars of some sort of current cultural stack, but we are part of 6 to 7 billion members of a species of primates. That's order of magnitude 10,000 more members of our species than would be present in any kind of stable equilibrium without our version of proliferation through culture, language, teaching, learning, guns, and medicine. So there's no doubt that the experiment's underway, and it's not with cockroaches, it's with us. We are, in fact, the experiment at the perturbation of the process of optimization. Our numbers are not optimal. They're way over optimal for everything else. So I don't understand, if by optimization there's anything having to do with reproduction, we've won the lottery. It's the rest of the planet that's at risk as a result. Right? I mean, there's no other thing this big that runs up into the billions for species numbers, right? Ever.
Well, I mean, optimality criteria really, it's totally parameter driven. I mean, it's just like what you're going to look at and decide what it is.
But it's because
but also it only exists with one set of background conditions. I mean, background conditions change, climate changes 20 years from now, and it's a whole different experiment.
Oh yeah, I agree. Aerosol-borne AIDS, and we're finished.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point is that optimization simply means, in terms of natural selection, whatever will provide the best ability to survive and to reproduce on the existing conditions. And the point is that optimization is always relative to the environment. I mean, so
yeah, that has to be to the environment.
It has to be to the environment.
So optimum is not maximum, is your
Of course not.
Okay, so we are non-optimal, although we are maximal.
No, we are just optimal with respect to whatever environment. And if things go the way they are moving, we won't be optimal for a very long time.
But do you think that humans necessarily evolved? Was that what you were leading up to saying?
Which?
That humans necessarily evolved? Was that what you were leading up to saying when you were giving that presentation?
I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that first of all, you have to remember that life has been on Earth for 3 billion years before there were any plants or animals. Any plants or animals. And the plants started first, and the animals started something like 600, a little more than 600 million years ago. That's 1/6 of the whole history of life. And what we do see in the evolution of life, that's a fact. Now, you have to explain it the way you want to explain it, but there is an evolutionary direction in the direction of increasing complexity. That is, they're always on the side.
You have an artifact.
You have perfectly good designs that go on and at the same level of complexity, and they're perfectly happy.
There's also decreasing complexity in some organisms. I mean, there's certainly multicellular plant lineages which have become single cellular. And that, I mean, I think that this idea of just going, you know, from amoebas to us is really like linear and anthropocentric, because I think that, you know, we look at that in the family tree of life, and certainly we see that it's not just everything toward greater and greater complexity all the time.
But it's responding to the environment, too.
Exactly. No, exactly.
Sure. So,
exactly.
Because, you see, the way I see it, you have, let's say, you have a vertical direction toward complexity, and you have a horizontal direction toward diversity at each level of complexity.
Right, but at the same time, if everybody
so worms are very happy at their level, and
you know, last common life ancestor, then we're all at the same. Everything that's on the twigs is at the same place.
It all depends on what you define by complexity. I think the complexity of the brain and of the brain products is to me, a good measure of complexity. And in that respect, I think what happens in our brains is more interesting and more complex than what happened in the brain of Lucy. And what happened in the brain of Lucy was probably more complex than what happens in the brain of a chimpanzee today. And what happens in the chimpanzee's brain is more complex than what happens in the rat's brain, and so on. I mean, maybe that sounds like a rather childish way of putting it.
I think that you could also argue that an increase in complexity is an increase in extremely complicated catalytic systems that have nothing to do with how we think or anything else, but have to do with, you know, breakdown of very, very complex molecules.
Well, we've achieved that. That was achieved 3 billion years ago or more. There has practically been no progress in terms of the chemistry of life in the last 3 billion years. E. coli does almost everything we can do, and all we do better than E. coli is regulate our genes.
Why is that?
Oh, wait a minute.
Oh.
That's some giveaway.
Yeah.
All we do, it's the same. In terms of complexity, all we do is regulate our genes is shorthand for by expanding the design space for regulation in the ever larger eukaryotic nucleus, given as a gift of endosymbiosis. We have the opportunity to have cells whose environment are other cells with the same genome. We have multicellularity, in which case we have networks of gene regulation which cross from one nucleus to another through cell contact and through hormones. We have an enormous expansion of regulation qualitatively, not quantitatively, so that the same families of genes can be found to accomplish enormous novelty in multicellular context as compared to a single.
Did I say anything different?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Well.
I thought you said all we have is increased regulation, but increased regulation is everything.
Well,
it is like being able to deal from a much larger depth.
What we have over E. coli is this tremendous ability. We don't have more genes, or hardly more genes. We have this tremendous ability of regulating the transcription of our genes, the expression of our genes, and that is
This is a very, I'm sorry for the arcane nature of this disagreement,
Makes
but I think we are in
differentiation.
violent agreement. What I'm saying is the regulatory part of a gene is as much a part of a gene as the coding part. It's also subject to mutation and selection. And much of natural selection is operated to expand and make more complicated the regulatory regions of a gene, because you can do more by working with something that already has a function and putting it in a different place at a different time than risking the change in the structure itself.
Sorry, I don't know why we have an argument, because I'm fully in agreement with you.
I said we were in violent agreement, because it's essential to say that the regulatory part of a gene is also under natural selective pressure through mutational variation. That even though it doesn't change the structure, it arises as a more complicated regulatory network through natural selection. That's what I wanted to say.
I know you
agree.
agree.
I know you. Could I raise a different question? I propose the list here. The question has to do with our particular effect on the future. And I think I tried to raise that question by saying that our numbers are remarkably out of whack with what they might have been absent that aspect of consciousness which gives abstraction, imagination, language, symbolic logic, and repression, and the capacity to deny the obvious so that one can move on in groups to do things that would be otherwise impossible as individuals. Given all of that, I am curious to hear what everybody else thinks why is it so difficult for us, given all of those facts, for us as a species to think as a species? Why do we find the persistence of what we know not to be biologically sound held as an absolute certainty by so many of us? In particular, I'm thinking of the biological absurdity of racism and the general notion that some things that look like people are not really people the way we are people. What is the selective advantage of that? What is the irreducible difficulty of getting rid of that? It seems to me that problem of denial of the facts of nature in group behavior is what threatens the planet and our species more than any technology that we may develop. And I'm just curious what any of you think is the reason we seem stuck with this, not failure of science, but failure to accept the facts of science as they apply to us. We are one species, we come out of Africa, we're all African subpopulations, and we act as if we can own each other. And in fact, in our constitutional history, we have owned each other. So why are we stuck with this particular failure to accept reality? I'll ask that in an analytic context. Why is this so hard to break through?
Well, I mean, I think that an argument could be made, and I'm not going to make this argument, but an argument could be made that over the last 20, 30,000 years, we're becoming different species.
Are you making that argument?
I'm not making it.
Good.
I don't believe in that argument, but I can see how that argument could be made. I mean, certainly if we look at species in the way that modern species concepts look at them as phylogenetic species concepts, that they're tied to two origins. That certainly like people from Africa, Western Europeans, that my wife's family from Asia and stuff, that they have a history which is much more common onto themselves than is common onto the species as a whole. So it's at a splitting point. I think that if I was modeling this on rodents in a computer, I know how I'd model it.
Well, I would say that part of the explanation, at least, it's a hard question, but part of it would be not biological at all, but it has to do with power relations and just sheer acquisitiveness and desire to dominate others for one's own advantage. So it's more that people generate those beliefs as a result of their desire to dominate others. It's just a convenient way to justify sheer, immoral domination of others.
Did I hear the word immoral?
Well, it would be good if you did. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
But we decided that black people were inferior because we found them people we wanted to dominate, rather than we dominate them because we found them inferior. And that would be the sort of political historical way to understand that type of phenomenon. I don't think that's the whole explanation, but
it can't be because we're surrounded by it today. Look at what happened in New Orleans. we uncover the fact that socially we behave that way today. Right?
Well, but as it's often said, there's an advantage to certain sections of the population in keeping other sections, the poor ones, poor, not getting our taxes, not getting our access to our wealth. And so we generate beliefs about groups which suit our desires. I mean, that's the...
So I've gotten two contradictory answers, in the sense that one answer is we ignore nature for our personal advantage, and the other answer is it's nature. So what's a third or fourth?
Well, I guess I have not thought about this question, but it seems to me that it comes from the fact that as we evolve, it's the Darwin thing. Those who came out ahead are the ones that that survived, and we're constantly striving for that. And I look at it, we're in families or other groups. There are groups. We learn to act as a group. And in our group, we're sort of concerned about the other people in that group, and what we want to be sure that we're ahead of those. So I see it as part of the struggle coming out of evolution.
At Catholic University, what do you say, even as an emeritus professor?
Well, this is out of my my range of competence. I think this is a socio-biological problem, and I haven't really given it much thought. I've read about it, and I understand that this may have its roots in the early history of humankind, when our ancestors were little bands of 30 or 40, and each band was competing with the other for a band. So we've kept this inherited tendency to form small groups and compete with other small groups. But I don't have more.
But when you talk about the origin of life and its future, what do you have in mind about the future?
The origin of?
Life and its future, what do you have in mind about the future?
Well, I'm impressed with the fact that I'm just now looking at the very latest phase in humanization, which is the growth of the human brain. Again, I'm sorry I have to talk about my book again, but there is a graph in that book which I constructed with information that I found in the literature about the brain size of different humanoids, and the length of time, the times during which they existed on Earth. I mean, fossils were found. You have, let's say, Australopithecus afarensis, you have Homo erectus, you have Homo heidelbergensis, you have Homo robustus, and so on. And amazingly, if you connect all these facts, then you get a curve that shows the increase in the human brain size, which is really absolutely fantastic. That is, it took 600 million years for the animal brain to grow from a size of 0 to 350 cubic centimeters, which is the size of the brain of a chimpanzee. And 6 million years ago, that's 99% at the end of that history, a branch detached from the chimpanzee branch. And then in about 2 million years, the brain size increased fourfold. Now this is absolutely fantastic, and it's an autocatalytic phenomenon. It's an exponential curve. Goes up to our brain and Neanderthalensis. Now the interesting thing is that all those ancestors, they're not ancestors, they're outshoots of our ancestors. Homo erectus, let's say. He detached from that line with a brain about 1,000 cubic centimeters, and persisted for about 1.5 million years, and then became extinct. They all became extinct. And now we are on top of that curve, and we also detached and flattened out. Our brain isn't increasing anymore. And how long it's going to last? Maybe 1 million years, maybe 200,000 years, I don't know. But it's almost bound to be extinct after a while. There's 3.5 billion years left, you know, at least. And so someday maybe this exponential increase will start again somewhere, and you will get bigger brains that will do things that we can't even dream of with their brains. And I think the word transient that you use, I like it very much, because I think you said anthropocentric, which I don't like very much, because we have to be anthropocentric. I mean, Drosophila is Drosophilocentric, and bats are batocentric, and mice are mice, whatever, neurocentric. So we have to be anthropocentric. But in a wider, let us say, view, with the 5 billion years to go for life on Earth, I think there's a good chance that bigger brains and maybe better brains than ours will some way arise. But I'm sorry that my own view of the future is that eventually humankind will disappear, like all the others.
Good. I've read something recently, this is not my area, but there seems to be some suggestion there is evolution of our brain. And it started, say, I forget how many, 60,000 or something years ago. It has gone rapidly. Why should it suddenly level off at this point? I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that we're still not going on that exponential growth.
You can ask why the brain of a Homo erectus is leveled off.
No,
all these others are leveled off, you know, so why not ours?
Well, if it's still evolving...
Oh, probably not in the good direction, probably in the bad direction.
Well, no, you can't say that. I don't think so. I mean, that's...
No, I think genetically we are doing the wrong thing right now for our own genetic future. We're keeping all kinds of bad genes reproducing artificially, and I think we are destroying our environment. We are doing all kinds of things that, if we could persist in doing that, should, in my opinion, eventually lead to our.
Can I finish, please? Yes, but if we're still evolving. The fact, I agree with you with the fact that we are limiting in our well-developed countries, not in our countries that are not well, where people are poor and not have health care, a certain amount we're changing natural selection. What are we selecting for? It sounds like if these people are correct to see these genetic changes, that we're seeing the change in the brain. And you might also argue we have more chances for this if we keep people alive or well. But in any event, I have the trouble with your feeling that it's ended at this point. I guess that's my concern.
Could I please remind everybody that we are living in a country with 50 million people have no access to health care except an emergency room because they have no health insurance, and there is no right to a doctor by citizenship. So let's not forget we are a developing country. We had an average life expectancy of 100 years ago in this city. We now have an average life expectancy of 70 to 75, and in some zip codes 80. That represents the preservation, as you say, of a vast amount of genetic information which would have died young. It's what we call medicine. It's what we call saving lives. It's what we call intervention to put off the disasters of the exigencies of the fate of one's parents' genes. Why? I don't believe you're saying that's a mistake, are you? Are you saying we should drop medicine and just survive because that would preserve the more hardy versions of our alleles? I mean, is not medicine wholly unnatural and wholly desirable at the same time? Wouldn't you say? I mean, would you not want to go to a doctor because the doctor interferes with natural processes?
Sorry, you seem to misunderstand what I say. No, of course not. I'm not advocating that. I'm advocating the fact that we are not very wise in managing the fruits of our intelligence. I mean, with our intelligence, we've created this extraordinary advanced civilization, technological civilization, medical, sociological, technical, whatever. and I think that is our doom, perhaps. Natural selection has favored intelligence, because that was what was really useful for the survival and reproduction of primitive humanoids and even of primitive humans. But natural selection has not, so far, privileged or favored the wisdom that is actually necessary to husband, to manage the fruits of the intelligence. And I think that may be a major evolutionary defect of the human race. And unless we can collectively use the intelligence we have, and we have plenty of that, if we can use it to somehow direct the politics of humanity in the way that will be at the same time protective of our own species, but also of all the other species we depend on.
In other words, as against what we said previously, and I agree with you, we need to act independent of natural selection. We need, in other words, to use free will to choose to act independent of natural selection. We need, in other words, to act rather than to behave. I agree with you 100%.
Sure.
But that would say we have escaped from natural selection. Right? And that would give us...
We haven't escaped, unfortunately.
No,
we haven't escaped.
We are not limited by natural selection.
We're not limited. We can counteract natural selection.
Good. I agree. Fine. Good. We're not in disagreement.
Good. We're making progress.
I was going to reformulate the point you were making to bring out a certain aspect of it. When you were saying how the brain suddenly had this huge growth, I think I would describe that as natural selection having discovered reason or conceptual thought. So up to that point, there was, I said before, there was the physical universe, there was life, there was consciousness, but much later on, there was reason or conceptual thought. And that was a huge discovery, and it was so heavily favored by natural selection because of its amazing usefulness that it grew extremely quickly. And I would define roughly, and there's a lot to be said about what reason is, but it basically means the ability for thought processes to mirror the structures of logic, deductive logic and inductive logic and scientific methods. And because brains of a certain species, ours, manage to have transitions within them that mirror these logical relations, which I think antecede all these evolutionary developments, that conferred on us a tremendous advantage. And I think, to follow up on the point you were making at the end of your remarks there, it's such a useful faculty that we have that evolution just ran away with it without really there being much time for counteracting elements to evolve side by side with it, such as the thing we might call wisdom or self-control or foresight. It's just too useful as a faculty. And unless, this is the point you were making, unless somehow we either, by means of natural selection or by counteracting it with our own willpower, unless we stop its just untrammeled tendencies, there's a danger in reason. Reason is the most dangerous thing that's ever evolved, because it's the only thing that can produce technology, and that's the most dangerous thing that there is. So, but it's a very recent evolutionary development.
I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the future?
I think the biggest hindrance to the future is just the decrease in biodiversity in general, of genetic material out there. The decrease in just genetic diversity on the planet in other species beyond ourselves, because that the world that we live in isn't just about ourselves, even as technologically advanced as we would ever be, that the rest of the species on the planet provide this great buffering system that provides our oxygen, that provides most of the food that we eat, everything else. And just the decrease in that biodiversity is the one that I think that will eventually do us in.
It's happened before. There have been several mass extinctions, and somehow
I think that's kind of an arguable thing myself. I mean,
all right.
It's just that people look, again, I don't want to keep harping on this, but
please.
It's just, if you take a really facile look at the fossil record and you just have, the time on one axis and number of species on the other axis, and you look at it, you see life has its ups and downs, okay? But then you start looking at it a little more sophisticatedly, and you say, well, how does that correlate just with the number of places on the planet where fossils have been found?
Sure.
And certainly some of these places where diversity goes down just means that there aren't any rocks for that particular time period preserved anywhere on the planet. So we really don't know. And I mean and a lot of these things, certainly these vacillations exist, but at the same time, when you really look at them, it's not the kind of story that's laid out quite often that that there's been these 5 great extinctions through time. So,
How long do we have?
You can take a few more minutes because I want to, or you can answer questions and make your points when you get questions.
I would like to bring up for 1 minute intelligent design, but please.
Okay. Well, I was just going to ask people, does it surprise people here who are scientists as much as it does me that only one species on our planet has evolved this thing called reason? I mean, many species have evolved eyes because eyes are incredibly useful things to have. Reason is an incredibly useful thing to have, and yet we're the only ones who have it.
Is it obvious that whales don't? How would we know?
Yeah,
well,
what's reason?
Let me be a little more pedantic. Sophisticated reason of the kind that produces science and technology and so on. It's such a useful thing.
You mean hands? Hands and minds.
And brains, yeah. Hands and brains, yeah. Why is this, other very useful adaptations are had across species. This one seems remarkably local. And it just seems a bit odd that should be so.
Maybe it touches on intelligence design.
I don't know, because there's been so much about intelligent design in the newspapers, and I really am very distressed by this whole thing, because I think it's a completely useless, stupid argument. I mean,
I'm with you.
We're all in agreement.
No, wait.
Who can use the strongest words?
No reason
I think my fellow scientists have not handled this situation very wisely, very well. First of all, they all talk about the theory of evolution. There is no theory of evolution. Evolution is a fact.
Exactly.
And as soon as a scientist starts saying the theory of evolution, they already give way to their adversaries. There is no theory of evolution. It's a fact, just as the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. It's a fact. What is a theory is the Darwinian theory. And there are about 5 theories of evolution. There's Darwinism, there's Lamarckism, there's a genetic drift, Kimura's theory, there's self-organization, there are a number of variants, punctuated equilibrium, whatnot. And scientists are still arguing about how much natural selection, about genetic drift, and so on. And intelligent design is just one more theory about evolution, about the mechanism of evolution. Because
much worse than that. You
How's it
cannot make a theory out of the statement that something cannot be tested.
Can I finish my argument?
Right.
Just a moment. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but I think I want to make this clear.
So we agree on
intelligent design is a theory about evolution which has been going on for 200 years. Lamarck was a finalist. It's been known in Europe as the name of finalism for 200 years. Bergson in France had a whole following, and all my professors at the Catholic University of Louvain were finalists and vitalists, except one, who was, fortunately for me, my mentor. And so this is nothing new, and it's just people who say
natural selection.
Natural causes do not explain everything. So there must be something else. And that has been going on for 200, this argument has been going on for 200 years. And I think it would be much wiser to tell the students, this is one other theory, and let us look at it objectively. Now, to say that something cannot be explained is not a theory, because it's heuristically sterile. It doesn't provide any experiment or suggest any experiment to throw it either to demonstrate it to be either wrong or right, and so on. So it's not a scientific theory, because it doesn't lead to scientific verification. That's one thing to tell the students. The other thing to tell the students is to take those books by William Dembski and Michael Behe, I've read them all, and say, now, let's look at their arguments. You know, the eye could not have evolved naturally, or a reptile could never have become a bird by natural. They say, but let's look at what we know about it, and let's put into this whole thing the time element and the number of elements, the number of individuals concerned, generations concerned at the time, and then show that there is in fact a perfectly acceptable explanation for what they say is unexplainable. But I think to handle and to equate intelligent design with creationism is completely wrong. Creationism is not a science. It's accepting what is written in the Bible literally. But this is not just saying, it's just saying science doesn't explain everything, and this has been going on all the time.
I don't know, I really disagree. I mean, to me, I think that first, I think you're right in characterizing intelligent design as something that's 200 years old, but I don't think that that's the way that it's being foisted on us today. I mean, basically today it's just a shill for creationism that these guys are trying to set us up with. Second, like not being a verificationist myself, you know, that I don't think science goes down that way. And I mean, I think that if you are a verificationist, is accepting intelligent design is something you have to engage as in science. But as somebody who's much more of a falsificationist, I don't think that it's not testable. You can't look at it that way. It's not science. It shouldn't be taught in science classes. If they want to teach it in a world religion or culture class, that's fine. But
that's the way it should be presented, and not as being religion.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I guess I think the terminology is a problem too. I mean, a theory is something that explains a large body of facts, or a large body of information, or you can put a lot of information into it. But the people who are talking about this are saying a theory is something just that hasn't been proven. And the proper term is intelligent design might be a hypothesis, which is something, well, maybe or maybe not, it's correct. But evolution is a theory. It fits a whole host of data, and that's the way we should be presenting it. When intelligent design doesn't
that's
do
what
that.
That's what I think is well, sorry, deplorable. Is that it is presented as a theory. Mm-hmm. It's not a theory.
It's not a theory.
It's a fact. I mean, heliocentrism is not a theory anymore. It's a fact.
Excuse me. This is the second time tonight that we're presented, I raised one and you've raised the other. We're presented with things we know to be so, we know to be demonstrably so, we know to be resistant to attempts at falsification, and yet we live in a society which denies them. We know it to be so that we are biologically interfertile across all 6 billion people at this point, so we're one species. We know that natural selection will select from among variants in us in a way we can't predict, and therefore we should preserve each other's differences. And yet we don't live that way. We know everything you say, and I think it's fair to say the people who call themselves proponents of intelligent design are not ignorant of the facts of natural selection or the facts of evolution. But we live in a society which denies those facts, as we live in a society which denies the facts of us being one species for the emergence of racism. My question goes back again to all of you and to the room. What is it, do you think, that allows such enormous, pervasive social repression and denial? Each of you, I mean, this is a building given over to the alleviation of the burdens of repression and denial in individuals. You have a society rich in denial here, and we are citizens of it. And I would argue that until and unless we confront that question, we will be continuously, I would say, artificially naive. Shocked each time something like this happens. But it will happen again and again. We will find a third emergence of the denial of nature for the sake of power or for some other reason. It seems to me as scientists, it's incumbent on us simply to tell the truth to power. It's an old slogan, but it works.
Okay, I'd like to open it to the audience. They can either answer Dr. Pollack's question or ask their own question.
I'm fascinated by what you propose, but I think that I think that you actually you frame it incorrectly, because if you look at the great genocides, you look at what the racisms in the world over history, they are much more within a genetic type or a racial type than across racial types. We have a particularly European tragedy in how we dealt with African slaves or black Africa, but you know, there have been genocides Africa to Africa. There are genocides in Cambodia, 20 years ago. There's what's going on, of course, the Holocaust, which was white people and white people, or Caucasian and Caucasian. So I think by looking at it purely as saying it's a racial thing, that we may be framing the question incorrectly. The heart of your question is, why do humans end up treating other humans in this particularly confounding way, I think is still a valid question.
Thank you.
The question of why the deniers of evolution, and particularly the intelligent design people, are so vehement is one that is very interesting, very perplexing to me. And I would welcome anybody who has thoughts on this, but first I want to throw out a few thoughts. First of all, we know that if, in fact, we're talking about shills for creationism, that we have a segment of the culture in this country that believe that if tenets of the Bible are questioned in terms of whether there was a Noah's Ark, whether there was a 7-day Genesis, whether creatures were created simultaneously in the space of 7 days, if that's wrong, well then morality is wrong, then the way their parents raised them is wrong, then the whole thing, the whole theology is a lie. And you'll see that some of these people, if you read the literature of creationism, they will then blame everything from abortion to homosexuality to drug addiction, to everything they conceive of as a social ill, to the advent of secular science, the advent of so-called Darwinian evolution. So that's one reason why they're in denial. It would tear apart the fabric of their morality, their social structure. Another point that was raised in a wonderful essay in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, the writer said, immortality, something we never discuss. We discuss differences in theology, we discuss differences in politics. Are there a number of people in this country that believe that eternal life is dependent on their denying evolution? Which is funny, because historically there was a time in the 1910s and 1915 when evolution was given as a rationale for then evolving into the next life, into the spiritualist plane. There were a whole bunch of people that believed evolution was a rationale for then evolving beyond the physical body. So they were once compatible. There were churches in the 19th century, including Beecher's famous church in Brooklyn, that took evolution as their theme. This was God's way of setting things in motion. And speaking to a mercantile audience, Beecher was fond of saying that that he doesn't believe that God is lesser for working in the wholesale than in the retail. In other words, he said it was not just if I found a watch in a factory that was in a field that had to be made in a factory or by a watchmaker, but in a factory that turned out hundreds of thousands of watches untouched by human hands, that was set in motion by some great designer of a factory, not just a watch. I won't go on, but I suggest, or I ask of you, that it's a very important thing to try to figure out just exactly why this denial is so vehement. What are the reasons behind it? What do people think they're going to lose if they believe in evolution and science? And let me leave it there.
One more comment.
Well, I was going to say I certainly don't know any answer to your question, but it strikes me as a wonderful mechanism for your concern that the human species is going to go on precisely because of that kind of behavior, because of our willingness to destroy biodiversity. And we shouldn't lose track of the fact that while in this country it's primarily fundamentalist Christians, in the Middle East it's fundamentalist Islamists, and there probably are other groups which have the same kind of...
Fundamentalist Jews, Islamists, and Christians all have the same denial of evolution and the same fundamental belief in creationism. There's no difference.
Okay, Larry, you're...
Well, I think we ought to consider, I don't know what the answer to the question is, but we ought to consider that imagination is one of the things that this group discusses. So that if we find that one of the concomitants of human abstraction, the idea of finding meaning in something beyond what you see, might extend to imaginary oppositions and imaginary demonizations and imaginary mythological proceedings that are going on, that it would be of a piece with the mental processes and not just a matter of denial.
Yeah, I agree.
I was in the same line. By talking about the origin of consciousness, I don't know what you think about, the attribution of meaning is the beginning of consciousness. And I think that how the group think about the attribution of meaning as the origin of consciousness,
well, again,
fermentation that will go into.
It does depend what you mean by consciousness. In a sense of consciousness, meaning would not be the origin of it, because I just meant things like simple sensations of pain and pleasure. And that wouldn't involve meaning if you mean something like linguistic propositional meaning. But if you mean by consciousness something more like reflection or reasoning, then it's going to be connected with language.
Sensations are going to be worked upon in order for the mind to start to work. That is one of the psychoanalytic theories about how the mind works. Is, you have physical sensations that are connected with material.
But we wouldn't.
Then from that on, you start to attribute meaning. Yeah.
But we wouldn't say, of a human infant at a certain stage or certain animals low down the phylogenetic scale, that they have meanings in the sense that they have language which expresses propositions.
No.
Although we would say they have conscious sensations of pain and pleasure. So, in one sense of the word consciousness, we wouldn't suppose it was the same thing as having meaning.
Let me try to answer your question through the notions I draw from my colleague Richard Dawkins, whom I don't agree with, but whose arguments seem to me to have great force. I would say, Dawkins would say, that in the mental world, a form of natural selection takes place among ideas. The ideas which are retained by their learners and taught well by their teachers survive in a competition with other ideas which are forgotten. And that in this mental world, what we call meaningful represents a mental version of Darwinian natural selection's success. But it has no more intrinsic meaning than the survival of one species over another has any meaning in nature. It's just the success in a competition in which success is its own reward. In other words, taken to its extreme, I think Dawkins's argument says meaning escapes itself. Meaning is something we credit successful mental parasites with. To the extent they infect us and we can't lose them, we call them meaningful. But there is no more intrinsic meaning in them than in the parasites that live in our stomachs or in our blood.
That is not a way to be, is another level of life that we can call mental life, and keep doing transformation.
I honestly think we must, confronted by Dawkins, say, thank you very much, but I accept some idea as intrinsically meaningful beyond its success in surviving in me. I think in the end, individuals vest their ideas with meaning in a way which is not rational, not embedded in natural selection, and not justifiable in nature.
Any other questions?
If I can bring psychoanalysis into the discussion, which maybe is appropriate in this building, as somebody said earlier. Psychoanalysis and evolution have very similar problems. I would say, for a good psychoanalyst, the unconscious is not a theory. Some have said Freud's theory was a theory of the unconscious. I would say the unconscious is a fact. And I would say good psychoanalysts or scientists who have studied psychoanalysis, including Edelman, who's a Nobel laureate, who wrote Bright Air, Brilliant Fire, and talks about Freud, he would say the unconscious is a fact, but yet that creates as much controversy, from what I see, as Darwin creates. And Jones, of course, called Freud the Darwin of the mind. And I think he had a reason for doing that. But I'd be curious to know what people's response to Freud is in the Philoctetes Center.
Does anybody want to comment on Freud?
I'd just make the comment that there are different notions of the unconscious again. I mean, there's a notion of the unconscious which, you know, cognitive scientists believe in, and there's processing going on in the brain of which we're not conscious, and it's relevant to what goes on in our consciousness, say, when we see things. That's probably a fact. But the idea that the Freudian unconscious specifically, with the specific properties it's supposed to have, in the way it generates dreams and results from repression, results from the Oedipus complex, I wouldn't say that was a fact. I would say that was a theory. I'd say it was a false theory myself. But I wouldn't say that was a fact.
We won't argue with that.
No.
Any other questions? There's a question.
Yeah,
sorry.
I'd like to ask people to speak more of wisdom. The comment about wisdom seemed to me raised as the key to our survival, that we need to go, and wisdom seems to imply thinking in a way that's larger than our own particular survival, or thinking in a bigger way. And so is this a step change, or I don't know, seemed like an important thing that we could...
Man's inhumanity to man in the last 100 years has been because some people have thought they had more wisdom and had evolved bigger brains, it seems to me.
The prayer that one says in the Jewish tradition every morning includes the phrase which translates, the beginning of wisdom is awe of God. And you may not have awe of God, but you should have awe of something and some modesty about how much you do not know in order to begin to have wisdom. I think I would say that about it. And I would say my wisdom tells me that my biological clock is telling me that I'm getting tired.
But we have one question from downstairs. Why is it so important for scientists who are religious but otherwise rational to believe that life is unique to Earth?
That's the data. When the data changes, then there won't be any problem with it. But that's the data. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sure. We don't have any other evidence. We're really constrained with all our work because we don't have we have one data point and that's it. Like
I object to the term believe. I don't think anybody, at least I don't believe that life is unique to Earth. Exactly. I think the probability is that there is life elsewhere. It's a personal estimate of probability, but it's not a belief. But certainly I disagree with being accused of believing life is unique on Earth.
We have an experiment of a sort. We have had coherent electromagnetic radiation in the radio frequency range emanating from our planet for about a century. So in a sphere 100 light years in radius, we should have been detected. And there are many, many stars with potential planets in that sphere. And in that time, we have not seen evidence that we have been detected by a life form capable of letting us know that. That's Enrico Fermi's paradox.
Somebody said that's a proof they are intelligent.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.